Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. When I finalized the sale of my company for $20 million, I thought I had finally purchased the one thing I never had: peace. But my lawyer did not pour champagne or congratulate me. He just leaned across the desk with a deadpan expression and gave me a single chilling instruction. "Call your parents," he said. "Tell them you lost every single penny." I am Evelyn Fox. At 34 years old, I had finally clawed my way to the summit. For the past 8 years, I lived on cold coffee, stale protein bars, and a relentless burning need to prove my existence. Northline Relay, the transportation optimization software company I'd built from a cramped, unheated apartment in Raleigh, was no longer just a struggling startup. It was an industry disruptor. I designed algorithms that rerouted national freight lines in milliseconds, saving logistics giants billions of dollars a year. I built an empire out of pure logic and efficiency because human emotions had always proven too volatile to trust. And earlier today, I sold my majority stake for $20 million. $20 million. When I saw the 9-figure equivalent transfer into my private accounts, I should have felt liberated. I should have felt like the ghost of my past had finally been laid to rest. But beneath the polished veneer of a newly minted multimillionaire, an old pathetic hunger gnawed at my stomach. I did not just want the money. I wanted the phone call. I wanted my parents to look at the daughter they had spent a lifetime branding as too stubborn, too difficult, and too detached from reality, and finally admit that I was the most successful person to ever carry the Fox name. My parents, Grant and Caroline Fox, lived in a world of Savannah garden parties and quiet judgments. To them, my career was a humiliating rebellion. Today, I wanted them to choke on their past dismissals. Instead of popping champagne or taking a victory lap, I found myself sitting across from my private attorney, Nolan Pierce. The air conditioning in his high-rise office hummed a low, sterile note, perfectly matching the stark glass and steel aesthetic around us. Nolan was not a man who smiled often, but today his demeanor was remarkably grim for someone who had just orchestrated a massive corporate acquisition. He sat with his hands steepled, staring at a thick manila folder that had absolutely nothing to do with Northline Relay. "We have a problem," Nolan said. His voice was flat, completely devoid of the celebratory tone I had expected. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, crossing my arms defensively. "The money cleared, Nolan. The ink is dry. There are no problems left." "Not with the sale," he replied, sliding the folder across the polished mahogany desk. "With your family, specifically with the estate of your late grandmother, June Mercer Fox." I stared at the unassuming folder. My grandmother had passed away 12 years ago, leaving behind what my parents always described as a modest, tangled mess of outdated assets that barely covered their own property taxes. I had never paid attention to it. My parents handled everything. They made sure I stayed far away from the legal logistics, citing my lack of traditional business sense and irony that tasted particularly bitter today. "What about it?" I asked, my heart rate picking up despite my feigned indifference. Nolan flipped the cover open, revealing stacks of highlighted legal documents, corporate registry prints, and financial statements. While conducting the standard background liability sweeps for the acquisition, I flagged a series of highly irregular filings attached to your name. Your parents have been executing obscure legal maneuvers for years. They are hiding something, Evelyn, something substantially larger than a standard modest inheritance. I scanned the papers, but the dense legal jargon blurred together in front of my eyes. Hiding what? They always said the estate was practically underwater. They lied, Nolan said plainly. He closed the folder with a sharp snap. He did not offer further explanations, and I knew him well enough to understand he was withholding the specifics for a specific reason. Nolan was a master strategist. He never revealed his entire hand until he knew exactly how the opposition would play theirs. "I need you to do exactly one thing tonight," Nolan continued, leaning forward. His eyes were cold and intensely calculating. "You are going to call your parents. You are going to tell them that you lost the $20 million. I blinked, certain the exhaustion of the week was making me hallucinate. "Excuse me. You will tell them that due to a sophisticated international wire fraud scheme, the postal accounts were drained. You are completely wiped out, penniless. Then you will stop talking and silently observe who reacts first and exactly how they react. A nervous, breathless laugh escaped my throat. The request was absurd. It was theatrical and completely unhinged. Nolan, I'm not going to call my mother and play some twisted psychological game just because you found a weird tax filing. It is not a game, Nolan said, his voice dropping an octave, striking the air with absolute certainty. And I am not testing my luck. I am springing a trap. If I am right about what is in these files, your sudden financial ruin will force their hand. They will panic, and people who panic make mistakes. I stared at him. The sheer conviction in his posture made my skin crawl. He was not guessing. He knew something horrifying, and he needed me to see it for myself before he laid out the evidence. The silence in the office stretched, thick and suffocating, finally with hands that felt unnaturally heavy. I pulled my phone from my bag. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the rally traffic flowing like rivers of light below. I needed to act. I needed to embody the catastrophic failure they always predicted I would become. I dialed my mother's number. The phone rang 3 times. With every ring, I focused on my breathing, forcing my chest to heave, letting the stress and isolation of the past 8 years flood into my throat to mimic a genuine nervous breakdown. Eveline Caroline Fox answered. Her voice was crisp, clipped, carrying that familiar undertone of perpetual impatience she always reserved exclusively for me. "Mom," I gasped. I let my voice crack, producing a controlled, trembling whisper that sounded terrifyingly real even to my own ears. "Mom, it is gone." "What is gone?" "Speak clearly, Eveline. You know I despise mumbling." "The money," I sobbed, gripping the cold glass of the window so hard my knuckles turned white. "The sale money, the 20 million. I clicked a verification link from the escrow agency, but it was a spoofed portal. It was an international routing scam. The accounts are completely drained. The bank says the funds were moved offshore in minutes. Mom, I have nothing. I am completely ruined." I stopped talking. I held my breath, waiting for the maternal instinct to kick in. I waited for the gasp of horror, the immediate panic for my well-being, the reassurance that I could come home, that we would hire the best investigators, that my life was not over. I waited for my mother to be a mother. The silence on the line was absolute. It stretched for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. I could hear the faint clinking of ice in a glass in the background. My mother was drinking her evening bourbon. She was completely, entirely calm. When Caroline finally spoke, her tone was entirely stripped of emotion. There was no shock. There was no pity. There was only a chilling clinical urgency. "Is there any chance of recovering the money? Or is it completely gone?" The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet below freezing. She did not ask if I was safe. She did not ask if I was holding up. Her only concern was the definitive legal status of my bankruptcy. "It is gone, Mom," I whispered, and this time the hollow devastation in my voice was entirely genuine. "The cyber division said the chance of recovery is 0%. I lost it all." "I see," Caroline said briskly, shifting into a terrifyingly administrative gear. "Stay where you are. Do not speak to the press. We will contact you shortly." She hung up. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the black screen. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. My entire life, I had believed their emotional distance was just a personality trait, a strict Southern stoicism. But that reaction was not stoic. It was calculated panic. It was the reaction of someone whose own hidden agenda had just been violently disrupted by my sudden, spectacular failure. Nolan watched me from his desk, his expression unchanged. He did not offer any empty platitudes or fake sympathy. He knew exactly what had just transpired. I stood up, feeling incredibly unsteady on my feet, as if the solid ground I had spent a decade building had simply vanished beneath me. The $20 million in my bank account could not protect me from the realization that I was entirely alone in the world. I left Nolan's office without saying another word. The drive back to my empty penthouse was was a blur of neon street lights and blinding headlights. I felt hollowed out, gutted by a betrayal I could not yet fully name. I walked into my dark apartment, not bothering to turn on the lights. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out at the city skyline, the glittering towers representing a world I had conquered, but a victory I had no one to share with. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a sharp, jarring vibration that cut through the dead silence of the room. I reached over and picked it up. It was a single text message from Nolan. There was no legal advice. There was no comforting reassurance. There was only one terrifying sentence, glowing in the harsh white light of the screen. Do not sleep. Tomorrow morning, you will see their true faces. I stared at Nolan's text for exactly 9 minutes. The digital clock on my nightstand flipped to 11:45 in the evening, casting a harsh red glare against the dark mahogany furniture of my bedroom. I had not moved an inch. My breathing was shallow, trapped somewhere high in my chest. Nolan had told me not to sleep, but sleep was a biological impossibility right now. The silence of my Raleigh penthouse was absolute, thick enough to drown in. Then, at precisely 11:54, the silence shattered. My phone did not just ring, it erupted. It was a violent, synchronized assault of digital notifications that made the device vibrate against my palm like a dying insect. The screen flared a blinding white, illuminating the dark room. I braced myself, expecting the delayed maternal panic from my mother, perhaps a frantic backpedaling, a sudden realization that her daughter had just lost everything. Instead, the lock screen displayed a rapid succession of names that made the blood freeze in my veins. Grant Fox, Mason Fox, and Helena, Uncle Robert. Helena and Robert had not sent me a single message in 6 years. Not when Northline Relay hit its first million in revenue. Not when I made the cover of a major tech magazine. Not even on my 30th birthday. But tonight, within 10 minutes of my staged financial ruin, they were suddenly in my inbox. I ignored their notifications, my thumb hovering over the message from my father. Grant Fox was a man of few words, and every single one he ever spoke was designed to control the temperature of the room. He did not call. A phone call meant dealing with an unpredictable human variable, and my father despised variables. I tapped his name. The text was 3 sentences long. There was no greeting. There was no question about my mental state. Do not talk to anyone outside the family about this. Come back to Savannah tomorrow morning immediately. There are papers to sign. I read the words again and then a third time. There are papers to sign. I pressed my free hand against my forehead, trying to manually force my brain to process the logic. If my mother had told him I was completely wiped out, the victim of a devastating international routing scam, what conceivable paperwork would require my immediate physical presence in Georgia? I was bankrupt in their eyes. You do not ask a bankrupt woman to sign documents unless her signature holds a value completely independent of her bank account. Before I could dissect my father's bizarre command, another message shoved its way to the top of the screen. It was from my younger brother, Mason. Mason was the golden child of the Fox family. While I was the stubborn daughter who moved away to write supply chain code, Mason stayed in Savannah, wearing tailored linen suits and playing the role of a boutique hotel developer. He was reckless, charming, and historically terrible at managing money. Yet my parents treated his every failure as a temporary stroke of bad luck. His message arrived in a frantic, unbroken block of text. Do not make a scene with the press or the buyers. Keep your mouth shut. Evelai. This has to be handled internally before it affects the other assets. Get on the first flight down here. I stopped breathing. My eyes locked onto 3 specific words in the middle of his panicked rambling. The other assets. I stood up abruptly, the phone slipping from my grasp and hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. I did not bother picking it up immediately. I walked to the floor, to ceiling, window, and pressed my palms against the cold glass. The other assets. For 34 years, the only family asset I had ever been made aware of was the crumbling, terminally mortgaged farmhouse my grandmother left behind. My parents complained about it endlessly at every Thanksgiving dinner I bothered to attend. They spoke of it like a burden, a useless pile of rotting wood and depreciating dirt that they were graciously managing out of pure familial duty. I had no connection to any other property. I held no shares in Mason's hotels. I was completely financially independent from the Fox name. So what assets could my bankruptcy possibly affect? The suffocating weight of Nolan's warning finally crushed the breath out of me. They are hiding something, Evelyn. I picked my phone up from the floor. The screen was uncracked. A small mercy. I did not reply to Grant. I did not reply to Mason. I sat in the dark, watching the hours tick by. Midnight bled into 1 in the morning, then 2. My mind raced through every interaction I had ever had with my parents regarding money. The way they aggressively steered the conversation away from my grandmother's estate. The way they insisted on handling my early tax returns before I hired my own firm. The way they always made me feel like an outsider in my own bloodline, keeping me just distant enough to maintain control, but close enough to monitor my movements. At almost 3 in the morning, the phone buzzed one last time. The exhaustion pulling at my eyelids vanished instantly. The notification was from Delaney Rhodes, my maternal cousin. Delaney was a wallflower, a quiet, observant girl who usually blended into the wallpaper at family gatherings. She never took sides, mostly because no one ever asked her to. There was no text attached to her message. It was just a single image file, a screenshot. I opened the image. My hands began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that radiated from my wrists all the way to my shoulders. It was a screenshot of a group chat on a secure messaging app. The chat was titled Fox Trust Management. I was looking at a digital room containing my father, my mother, my brother, and the family accountant. A room I had never been invited to. A room I was never supposed to know existed. At the very top of the captured screen, a message from my mother, Caroline, sat like a loaded gun. She is completely broke. This is the only chance to get her signature before the riverfront deal closes. Grant, tell her to come home. Directly beneath her, Mason had replied less than a minute later. Play the sympathy card. If she is really wiped out, she will sign anything as long as she thinks she's being saved. We just need her name on the release. I stared at the glowing pixels until they burned into my retinas. The nausea hit me so hard and so fast I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to keep from gagging. The room spun, the sharp edges of my expensive furniture blurring into meaningless shapes. The riverfront deal. I read the 3 words over and over again. My brain, trained to analyze data and find patterns, violently reassembled the reality of my entire existence in the span of 30 seconds. The profound hollow grief I had felt just hours ago in Nolan's office evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. The shock was no longer that my parents had believed my utter ruin so quickly and without a single shred of empathy. The shock was the horrifying realization of why they were so eager to believe it. They were not panicking because I was in danger. They were panicking because a multi-million-dollar property deal involving a riverfront I knew absolutely nothing about was on the line, and somehow my name was the only key to unlocking it. Mason's words echoed in the dark room. She will sign anything as long as she thinks she is being saved. They thought I was bleeding out on the floor, and instead of calling for an ambulance, they were rushing over to harvest my organs before the heart stopped beating. They needed my desperation. They needed me broken, humiliated, and terrified of the future. So I would blindly hand over whatever hidden empire they had been building behind my back. The tremor in my hands stopped. The cold sweat dried on my skin. I closed the image and opened a new message window to Nolan Pierce. I did not type a paragraph. I did not ask for an explanation. I typed exactly 4 words. I am going home. I locked the screen and tossed the phone onto the bed. I walked into my massive custom-muled closet and pulled down a sleek leather overnight bag. I began packing precisely, methodically. A tailored charcoal blazer, a crisp white silk blouse, the kind of clothes you wear when you are about to dismantle a corporation or a family. Nolan had been right. It was not a game, and he was not testing my luck. He had handed me a scalpel and forced me to cut open the rotting underbelly of the Fox legacy. They wanted me to come back to Savannah a broken, penniless failure, ready to beg for scraps from the family table. They wanted the girl they had spent decades trying to shrink into submission. I zipped the leather bag shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent apartment. I was not the naive girl who left Georgia 8 years ago. I was the architect of North Line Relay. I knew how to map a system, identify the structural vulnerabilities, and execute a total systemic override. My parents had spent my entire life treating me like a liability. In just a few hours, they were going to find out what happens when the liability decides to audit the ledger. The sun had barely breached the Raleigh skyline when I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the legal firm. It was 6:15 in the morning, but the air inside was already charged with the sterile, hyper-focused energy of a war room. The exhaustion of the past 24 hours sat heavy in my bones. Yet my mind was vibrating with a dangerous razor-sharp clarity. I bypassed the empty reception desk and walked straight into the private office. Nolan was already waiting. He stood by a massive mahogany conference table, his suit jacket discarded over a chair, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. The surface of the table was no longer empty. It was entirely covered with architectural blueprints, county tax records, and thick binders filled with dense legal filings. "Sit down," he instructed, his voice lacking any conventional morning pleasantries. He pushed a steaming mug of black coffee across the polished wood. I took a seat, my eyes scanning the chaotic spread of documents. "Tell me what you found. Tell me exactly what my family has been doing while I was building my company." Nolan leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the table. "For decades, your parents have maintained a very specific narrative about your grandmother's estate. They painted it as a financial burden, a crumbling farmhouse, and a few acres of useless, sinking mud. You believed them because there was no reason not to. They complained about the property taxes at every holiday dinner," I replied, my voice tightening. "They said keeping the estate afloat was a family sacrifice." "It was a masterclass in misdirection," Nolan corrected sharply. He tapped a thick leather-bound folder resting in the center of the table. "Your grandmother June did not just leave behind a farmhouse. She established a highly insulated legal entity called the Mercer Preservation Trust. Your parents are the current co-trustees, but the assets within that trust are not residential. They are commercial and they are massive." He slid a large rolled-out map across the table. It was a topographical survey of Savannah. Nolan picked up a red marker and circled a vast, sprawling section of land running directly alongside the water. "The trust holds title to a complex of old cold storage warehouses, a massive tract of undeveloped riverfront land, and most importantly, exclusive access rights to a dormant commercial railway spur," Nolan explained, his eyes locking onto mine. I stared at the red circle, feeling the air thin out in my lungs. As the founder of a transportation optimization company, I did not need an analyst to translate what I was looking at. In the modern supply chain industry, riverfront acreage connected directly to a rail line was not just land. It was the holy grail of logistics. With the current boom in e-commerce and global shipping, that specific combination of infrastructure was worth an astronomical amount of money. "They own this," I whispered, my mind struggling to align my parents, two people who claim to barely understand modern technology, with a commercial empire. "The trust owns it," Nolan corrected gently, "and for years it sat dormant. But in the past 8 months, the city of Savannah approved a massive multi-billion-dollar private redevelopment project for that exact sector of the riverfront. The developers need the Mercer land to connect their new shipping hub to the national rail grid. Without that specific plot, the entire logistics network of their project bottlenecks." Nolan began flipping open the binders, revealing pages of freshly stamped corporate filings. The moment that redevelopment project was green-lit, the value of the trust skyrocketed. Suddenly, your parents were sitting on an absolute gold mine. I tracked a sudden, frantic flurry of legal activity beginning around the first of the year. They have been quietly preparing to transfer the land, drafting massive commercial mortgages, and aggressively restructuring the trust into a series of shell companies. "So, they are cashing out," I said, a bitter taste rising in the back of my throat. "They are selling the land behind my back and pocketing the windfall. They are trying to," Nolan countered, tapping his finger against a specific highlighted paragraph on a dense legal contract. "But they hit a brick wall. In every single recent filing, in every draft of the sale agreement with the developers, the title companies flagged a major discrepancy. The transactions cannot be legally executed by the car Rusties alone. He turned the document around so I could read the highlighted text. Your grandmother was a very paranoid, very intelligent woman, Nolan continued softly. She structured the Mercer Preservation Trust with a safeguard, a fail-safe designed to prevent the exact kind of asset liquidation your parents are currently attempting. The final closing documents require the explicit notarized signature of a specifically designated special beneficiary. I looked up from the paper, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. You, Nolan confirmed. You are the special beneficiary. Your parents cannot sell the riverfront. They cannot leverage the rail rights. They cannot touch a single dime of that new development money unless you sign a comprehensive waiver relinquishing your foundational rights to the trust. The physical sensation of nausea washed over me so intensely, I had to grip the edges of the table to anchor myself. The room seemed to tilt. Every single memory I had of my childhood, of my agonizingly strained relationship with my mother and father, was violently tearing itself apart and rearranging into a terrifying new picture. They never told me. I breathed, the realization ripping through me like a physical blade. They spent my entire life telling me I was useless with money. They mocked my interest in logistics. They pushed me away every time I tried to ask about the family finances. Because ignorance was their greatest weapon, Nolan said, his voice dropping to a low, steady hum. If you knew what you owned, you would ask questions. If you understood the value of the land, you would demand an audit. Their entire dynamic with you, the belittling, the emotional distance, the constant criticism, was not just bad parenting. It was a calculated long-term legal strategy to keep you as far away from the paperwork as humanly possible. I squeezed my eyes shut. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally perfect, that it felt like I was drowning in ice water. They did not just fail to love me. They weaponized my desire for their approval. They kept me starved for affection so that when the time finally came, I would be weak enough to surrender whatever they demanded. And now, Nolan said, breaking through the ringing in my ears, you have just handed them the perfect opportunity. They think you lost $20 million. They think you are broken, humiliated, and desperate for a lifeline. They are going to ambush you the second you walk through the door of that farmhouse. They will frame the waiver as a necessary evil to protect you from liability or offer you a tiny fraction of the payout as a fake rescue package. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek black object, no larger than a standard thumb drive. He slid it across the table toward me. What is that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. A high-fidelity digital audio recorder. Nolan replied. Georgia operates under a one-party consent law for recording conversations. As long as you are actively participating in the dialogue, you do not need their permission to record every single word they say in that house. I picked up the device. It felt unnaturally heavy for its size. You have all these documents. You have the paper trail. Why do I need to wear a wire? Why not just show me everything right now and let me walk in there with an injunction? Nolan shook his head, his expression hardening into something completely ruthless. Because paper trails can be disputed in court. Shell companies can be blamed on bad financial advisors. If I show you the entire depth of their fraud right now, you will walk into that house with the cold, calculated anger of a CEO. I do not want the CEO. I need the daughter. I stared at him, understanding slowly dawning on me. They need to believe the illusion, Nolan explained. They need to see the devastated, heartbroken woman they think they created. Your shock, your confusion, your grief. It has to be completely authentic. If they sense even a fraction of a percent of suspicion from you, they will shut down, destroy the drafts, and change their strategy. I need them arrogant. I need them to explain the trap out loud while the recorder is running. Once they commit their extortion to tape, I will have enough leverage to not only stop the sale, but to dismantle their entire control over the trust. I looked down at the recorder in my palm. The idea of walking into my childhood home knowing they were looking at me, not as a child to be comforted, but as a target to be liquidated, felt like preparing to walk into a burning building. I stood up, slipping the recorder into the inner pocket of my blazer. I gathered my purse, the leather strap feeling like a lead weight on my shoulder. I am leaving for Savannah now, I said, my voice finally losing its tremor, replaced by a cold, hollow calm. Nolan walked around the table, stopping just a few feet away from me. The clinical strategic distance he usually maintained dropped for a fraction of a second. He looked at me with a profound, sobering intensity. "Eveline," Nolan said, his voice piercing through the quiet of the office. "When you walk into that house, remember exactly why you are there. Do not look for an apology. Do not look for a misunderstanding. If they are more eager to get your signature, then they are heartbroken over your suffering. You have to accept the reality." He paused, letting the silence stretch between us until the words hit with the force of an executioner's block. "You were never a daughter in their eyes. You are an obstacle." The gravel driveway crunched under the tires of my rental car, a harsh grating sound that shattered the heavy Savannah humidity. I parked in front of the farmhouse. For my entire life, this two-story structure, with its peeling white paint and sagging wraparound porch, was the physical embodiment of my parents' supposed financial martyrdom. Today, it looked exactly like what it was, a stage set. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden floorboards groaning under my weight, and pushed the heavy oak front door open. The transition from the sweltering Georgia heat to the heavily air-conditioned interior made my skin prickle. I walked toward the formal dining room, the soles of my shoes echoing in the quiet hallway. As I crossed the threshold, my stomach plummeted. Nolan had warned me, but seeing the trap perfectly laid out in my childhood home was a visceral blow. This was not a family gathering to mourn a devastating loss. It was a corporate tribunal dressed up as an intervention. The antique mahogany dining table was cleared of its usual decorative centerpiece. In its place sat precise stacks of legal documents, 2 expensive fountain pens, a crystal pitcher of ice water, and 4 heavily starched linen napkins. My father, Grant, sat at the head of the table wearing a pressed navy suit. My mother, Caroline, stood near the window, her posture rigid. Sitting awkwardly to Grant's right was a man I recognized immediately as the longtime family accountant, a nervous, balding man who clutched his briefcase like a shield. My mother crossed the room the second I appeared. She did not offer a word of comfort. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a stiff, bloodless embrace that felt more like a physical restraint than a hug. Her expensive floral perfume burned my nostrils. She leaned in close, her voice a sharp, hissing whisper meant only for me. "Pull yourself together, Eveline. You have to cooperate right now if you want to salvage whatever dignity you have left after this spectacular mess." She pulled away before I could even process the cruelty of the greeting. She gestured toward an empty chair directly opposite my father. I sat down, the digital recorder hidden in the inner pocket of my blazer, pressed coldly against my ribs. A solid grounding reminder of why I was really here. "Eveline," my father began, his voice adopting a low-practice tone of mournful authority. "Your mother and I were entirely devastated by your phone call last night. To lose $20 million overnight to a careless cyber scam is a catastrophic failure of judgment." I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, forcing my shoulders to slump, playing the part of the shattered, defeated daughter. "I lost everything. Dad, I do not know what to do." "We know," Grant said smoothly, sliding the thickest stack of paper across the polished wood toward me. "And that is exactly why we had to assemble so quickly today. Your financial ruin is a tragedy, but we cannot allow your compromised state of mind to infect the rest of the family's modest holdings. You are clearly in no condition to manage assets." I looked down at the top page. It was a voluntary relinquishment of trust oversight. "Because you are completely wiped out," Grant explained, tapping the page with his index finger. "We need you to sign this immediately. It temporarily suspends your beneficiary rights and legally confirms that you lack the financial competence to participate in any decisions regarding the family estate. It is a protective measure, Eveline, for your own good." I shifted my gaze to the far corner of the room. My younger brother, Mason, was slouched in a wing-back chair. He wore a perfectly tailored linen shirt holding a glass of iced tea. He had positioned his cell phone against a stack of coasters on the side table. The screen was dark, but the angle was perfectly aimed at my face. He was not just watching me. He was recording me. He was waiting for me to break down, to sob, to throw a hysterical fit so he could capture irrefutable digital proof that I was mentally unstable. I swallowed hard, forcing a tremor into my hands as I reached for the document. I slowly turned the pages, acting as though my vision was blurred by tears, but my eyes were sharp. I scanned the dense paragraphs, instantly spotting the poison pill Nolan had prepared me for. It was buried on the 7th page under a misleading header. If I signed this document, I would not just be suspending my rights. I would be authorizing a blanket indemnification. The clause explicitly stated that I absolve the current trustees of any and all liability regarding their management, transactions, and restructuring of the trust over the past 12 years. It was a complete legal pardon for every single dollar they had stolen, and a free pass to finalize the sale of the riverfront. "Dad," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "This is so much paperwork. I cannot even think straight. Why does this have to be done today? I just lost my entire company 12 hours ago. Can we not wait a few weeks?" Pratt's jaw tightened. The facade of the caring patriarch slipped, revealing the ruthless panic underneath. "We cannot wait," he snapped, his voice rising sharply. "A riverfront deal cannot wait for you to finish collapsing." The entire room went dead silent. The accountant flinched, staring down at his shoes. Mason sat up straight, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. My father's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson as he realized he had just spoken the quiet part out loud. He had practically screamed their hidden agenda into the open air. Caroline immediately stepped in, launching a vicious psychological offensive to cover her husband's fatal slip. "Do not dare question your father after what you have done," she sharply reprimanded, slamming her palm against the back of my chair. "You have no right to come in here and ask for time. You walked away from this house 8 years ago. You abandoned us to play startup CEO. You only cared about your code and your algorithms. You never understood loyalty. Evelyn, you never understood what it means to be a family." Every word she spat at me was designed to break my spirit. She was weaponizing my independence, twisting the years I spent building my own success into a malicious act of betrayal. In her twisted logic, my greatest sin was not that I had supposedly lost the money. My greatest sin was that I had ever succeeded without needing them in the first place. They wanted me destitute because a destitute daughter was a compliant daughter. "I just wanted you to be proud of me," I choked out, a genuine ache swelling in my throat, though not for the reasons they believed. I was mourning the parents I never actually had. Mason let out a short, hollow laugh from his corner. He picked up his iced tea, taking a slow sip before looking at me with absolute, unfiltered disdain. "Oh, spare us the victim routine," Mason sneered, his eyes locking onto mine with an icy entitlement. He gestured lazily toward the fountain pen resting on the documents. "Just pick up the pen and sign it, Evelyn. At least for the first time in your entire life, you will actually do something useful for this family." The sheer humiliation of the moment hung in the air, thick and suffocating, a perfectly orchestrated execution of my dignity. They were all staring at me, waiting for me to surrender, waiting for the broken girl to finally submit to the slaughter. I looked at the pen, then I looked at the thick stack of papers. The digital recorder pressed against my side, capturing every single breath, every insult, every damning confession. I reached out and wrapped my trembling fingers around the cold metal barrel of the pen. The cold metal of the fountain pen warmed against my trembling fingers. I hovered the nib just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. My father leaned forward, his eyes hungry, tracking the movement of my hand like a hawk watching a dying rabbit. Then the heavy oak front door of the farmhouse did not just open. It was thrown wide open, the brass hinges screaming in protest against the sudden violence. Heavy measured footsteps echoed down the hallway. The suffocating tension in the dining room snapped instantly. My father jerked upright, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. My mother spun around, a sharp reprimand already forming on her lips for whoever dared interrupt her private execution. Nolan Pierce stepped into the threshold of the dining room. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a sleek black leather briefcase. He did not look angry. He did not look out of breath. He radiated a terrifying glacial calm that instantly dropped the temperature in the room by 10. He walked directly to the mahogany table, completely ignoring the bewildered gasps of my parents. "Where the hell are you?" Grant demanded, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. "This is a private residence. Get out before I call the local authorities. I would advise against involving law enforcement, Grant," Nolan said, his voice smooth and lethargic, yet cutting through the room like a surgical blade. "Given the contents of my briefcase, the police are the last people you want walking into this house today." Caroline turned pale. The meticulously crafted mask of the concerned mother shattered completely. She recognized the sharp, undeniable scent of corporate litigation. Her internal, quiet family matter had just been spectacularly breached. In the corner, Mason scrambled. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face as he lunged forward and slapped his cell phone face down on the side table, desperate to stop the recording he had started. But it was far too late. The high-fidelity digital device, tucked safely against my ribs, was already capturing every ragged breath and panicked shuffle in the room. Nolan stopped directly behind my chair. He placed a hand on the back of it, a physical barrier between me and my family. "My name is Nolan Pierce," he announced, looking around the table with mild disgust. "I am Eveli Fox's private legal counsel, and I am here to inform you that the transaction you are currently attempting to extort from my client is permanently halted." The family accountant let out a pathetic squeak, shrinking back into his chair, violently shoving his own papers back into his briefcase. "Extort?" Caroline gasped, recovering her voice. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "How dare you bring a lawyer into this house? We are trying to save her. She lost $20 million last night. She is completely bankrupt." Nolan did not even blink. He reached down, unlatched his briefcase, and let the heavy leather lid fall open. "She did not lose a single dime," Nolan stated flatly. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears after a bomb detonates. Grant stared at Nolan. Caroline stared at me. Mason stopped breathing entirely. "The $20 million from the Northline Relay acquisition is sitting securely in an insured multi-tiered trust account," Nolan continued, his tone conversational as if discussing the weather. "The story about the international wire fraud was a fabricated scenario. I instructed Eveli to make that phone call to test a hypothesis. We needed to see if the Fox family would react to her catastrophic ruin with unconditional love or with predatory greed. You answered that question in less than 12 hours. I slowly placed the fountain pen back onto the table. I sat up straight. The manufactured tremor in my hands vanished. The slumped, defeated posture evaporated. I looked directly at my father, and for the first time in my life, I did not see a towering patriarch. I saw a terrified small man. "You lied to us," Grant whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of shock and rising fury. "I learned from the best," I replied coldly. Nolan began pulling documents from his briefcase, slapping them down onto the antique mahogany table right on top of the fraudulent relinquishment papers my father had prepared. The sharp smacks of paper against wood sounded like gunshots. "Let us talk about Rook Bass Limited Liability Company," Nolan dropping a thick stack of bank statements and incorporation filings. My mother let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Grant practically collapsed back into his chair. "A fascinating corporate entity," Nolan mused, pacing slightly. "Registered 3 years ago in Delaware. The primary signatories are Grant and Caroline Fox. For the past 36 months, Rook Basin has been siphoning management fees, artificial rent increases, and massive unsecured loan values directly out of the Mercer Preservation Trust. You had absolutely no right to look into our private businesses," Mason shouted from his corner, his voice cracking with panic. Nolan turned his glacial stare onto my brother. "I have every right, Mason, when the money stolen from that trust is being used to artificially prop up your failing boutique hotel development on the riverfront. You needed liquidity. Your parents provided it by secretly collateralizing the very trust they were sworn to protect. They mortgaged Eveli's inheritance to fund your incompetence." The accountant was now sweating profusely. Looking desperately at the front door, Nolan dropped another file onto the table. "And when the riverfront redevelopment project was announced, You realized the land in the trust was suddenly worth an astronomical fortune. You arranged to sell a prime parcel of the estate to the developers. The only problem was the special beneficiary clause. You needed Evelyn to waive her rights before she ever found out she had the power to veto the entire sale. My father tried to rally. He slammed his fist onto the table. I am the trustee. I have the discretionary power to suspend the rights of a careless beneficiary to protect the estate. That clause in the foundational document gives me the absolute authority to remove her. Nolan actually smiled. It was a terrifying expression. You really should have hired better lawyers. Grant, Nolan said, sliding a highlighted copy of my grandmother's original foundational trust document across the table. That clause does not allow you to suspend a beneficiary for personal carelessness. It is a fiduciary safeguard. It specifically states that any attempt by a managing trustee to self-deal, embezzle, or coerce a beneficiary results in the immediate non-negotiable termination of their trustee status. The color completely drained from my father's face. He looked at the highlighted text as if it were written in a foreign language. The weapon they had tried to use against me had just been turned around and pressed directly against their own throats. Nolan pulled 2 final documents from his briefcase. They were clean, simple, and utterly devastating. He placed one in front of Grant and one in front of Caroline. These are voluntary letters of resignation, Nolan instructed. You will resign as the co-trustees of the Mercer Preservation Trust, effective immediately. You will surrender all administrative control to Evelyn. If you sign these documents right now, we will freeze the assets and handle the transition quietly. And if we refuse, Caroline hissed, her eyes filled with venomous hatred. If you refuse to sign, Nolan replied, leaning over the table, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, I will walk out of this house and immediately file an injunction with the state court. I will request a comprehensive forensic audit of every single transaction moving between the trust, Rook Bass, and Mason's Hotel over the past 12 years. I will hand the evidence of your wire fraud, embezzlement, and fiduciary breach directly to the federal prosecutors. You will not just lose the riverfront deal. You will go to federal prison. The dining room felt like a vacuum. The power dynamic had shifted so violently and so rapidly that the air itself felt heavy. The trap they had spent months building had just slammed shut on their own legs. I watched them suffocate under the weight of their own arrogance. The mighty Fox family reduced to common criminals sitting at a dining room table. Caroline looked at Grant, pure terror in her eyes. Mason was completely silent, his face pale and slick with sweat. I waited for my father to reach for the pen. I waited for the final surrender. Instead, Grant slowly lifted his head. The panic that had gripped him just moments ago began to recede, replaced by a dark, chilling defiance. He did not look at the resignation papers. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Nolan, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. He was cornered, bleeding and facing total destruction, but he looked like a man who was still hiding a loaded weapon under the table. Grant pushed his chair back slightly, interlocking his fingers. He spoke with a terrifying, icy calm that made the hair on my arm stand up. You have a very impressive briefcase. Mr. Pierce, Grant sneered, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. But you are still missing the original files. You are operating on assumptions and secondary copies. You still do not have the one thing necessary to take us down. Grant pushed the resignation papers back across the antique mahogany table. His movements were deliberately slow, an arrogant attempt to reclaim the suffocating authority he had wielded over me since childhood. He interlocked his fingers, resting them over the damning evidence Nolan had just presented. You have an impressive collection of photocopies and circumstantial deductions. Mr. Pierce, Grant sneered, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. But you do not have the original supplemental will. You do not have the physical quartalized piece of paper. Your entire legal theory is nothing but a fairy tale built on administrative errors. I will not sign a damn thing, and no judge in the state of Georgia will grant an injunction based on a lawyer playing a guessing game. Seeing her husband hold the defensive line, my mother immediately changed her strategy. The vicious attacking matriarch vanished in the blink of an eye. She collapsed back into her chair, pressing a heavily starched linen napkin to her face. She began to weep. It was a terrifyingly perfect performance, her shoulders shaking with exactly the right amount of maternal heartbreak. "How can you do this to us?" Caroline sobbed, looking at me through her tears as if I were a monster who had just broken into her home. "Every single decision we ever made, every late night, every stressful financial maneuver was to preserve this estate for the next generation. We sacrificed our own peace of mind to keep the Fox legacy intact, and you repay our sacrifice by dragging a corporate attack dog into our dining room. You treat us like common criminals. You bring a lawyer into your own childhood home as if you are calling the police to arrest your own flesh and blood. You are incredibly ungrateful, Evelyn. You always were." The sheer audacity of her guilt trip was staggering. She was standing in the middle of a trap she had set to steal my inheritance. Yet she was desperately trying to cast me as the villain for refusing to step into it. I did not even have the chance to process her emotional whiplash before a new, much dirtier threat emerged from the corner of the room. Mason had stopped pretending to be a concerned brother. He was slouched in his wing-back chair, his thumbs flying furiously across the screen of his smartphone. He was not just texting his friends. He was launching a scorched earth digital counterattack. Within 20 minutes, my own phone, resting quietly in my pocket, vibrated with an urgent alert. I pulled it out to find a highly sensitive email from the lead integration officer at the firm that had just acquired Northline Relay. The subject line read simply, "Urgent inquiry regarding leadership stability." I opened the message, my blood running cold. Mason had reached out to his network of local Savannah investors, venture capital brokers, and business associates. He had spun a rapid, venomous narrative that I was suffering from a severe acute psychiatric breakdown following the stress of the corporate buyout. He claimed I was highly unstable, hallucinating massive financial conspiracies, and turning violently against my own family in a paranoid frenzy. The rumor had spread like wildfire through the tight-knit Southern business community, eventually reaching the ears of my corporate buyers. They were writing to ask, in extremely polite but panicked corporate terminology, if there were undisclosed reputational risks or mental health liabilities they needed to address before the final merger transition was completed. Mason was trying to destroy my professional reputation to discredit any legal claims I might make against them. I showed the email to Nolan. He barely glanced at the glowing screen before turning his glacial stare back to my brother. "Let him type," Nolan said quietly, though his voice carried effortlessly across the room. A smear campaign is always the desperate last resort of a drowning man. Nolan turned his attention back to his open briefcase. He pulled out a slender, pale blue folder that he had deliberately held back during the initial confrontation. He dropped it onto the table with a soft thud. "Since we are on the topic of sacrifices made for the next generation, Caroline," Nolan said, his voice entirely devoid of pity, "let us examine the June Mercer Memorial Scholarship." My mother stopped crying instantly. The linen napkin dropped to her lap. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his arrogant posture faltering. Nolan opened the blue folder, spreading out a series of internal banking ledgers and wire transfer receipts. I was curious why a small charitable educational fund was generating so much administrative overhead, Nolan explained, tracking the numbers with his pen. It turns out the scholarship was never actually funding any student tuition. It was an elaborate accounting smoke screen. You and Grant were cycling commercial rent revenue from the trust through the charity to wash the funds. Then you were immediately distributing that money as anonymous private grants to cover Mason's catastrophic personal debts and luxury expenses. You turned a charitable foundation named after your deceased mother into a personal slush fund to finance your son's failures. The absolute depravity at stealing from a memorial fund to cover Mason's gambling debts and failed hotel ventures shattered the remaining tension in the room. I looked at Caroline, feeling a wave of disgust so profound it physically itched behind my ribs. "A scholarship fund, Mom?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of horror and outrage. "He used my grandmother's name to hide his debts." Caroline stood up, her face twisting into an ugly, defensive mask. The tears were gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered fury. "We had no choice," she screamed, her voice echoing violently off the peeling wallpaper of the dining room. Mason was in terrible trouble. Real trouble with private aggressive lenders. We had to protect him. We used every single thing we had to keep him out of a courtroom and out of jail. We gave up everything. We even put this house on the line." The air in the room completely vanished. I stared at her, the words hanging in the dead space between us like a physical manifestation of a curse. "This house," I repeated, my voice dropping to a hollow, barely audible whisper. Grant lunged forward, grabbing his wife's arm to silence her. But the damage was already done. The confession had left her lips, grotesque and entirely undeniable. For my entire life, this old creaking farmhouse was the only pure memory I had left. It was the place where my grandmother used to sit with me on the porch during the humid summer evenings, teaching me how to play chess while my parents ignored me and sighed. They had always sworn that no matter how difficult the property taxes became, they would never ever sell or leverage the farmhouse because it was a sacred family monument. They told me it was the one thing they were protecting for the sake of our history. "You mortgaged the farmhouse," I said, stating it not as a question, but as a finalized death sentence for my entire childhood. "You took the only piece of her memory that actually meant something to me, the only place in the world I ever felt safe, and you handed the deed over to a bank to bail out your golden child." Caroline refused to look at me. She stared stubbornly at the far wall, her silence confirming every horrible, heartbreaking truth. She had traded my only sanctuary for Mason's mistakes, and she had never intended to tell me. That was the exact moment. The very last remaining thread of my empathy snapped. The lingering, pathetic ache of a daughter wanting to be loved by her parents completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, absolute vacuum. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger requires passion, and passion is a vulnerability. I felt nothing but a surgical mechanical resolve to dismantle them piece by piece. They had gambled away my sanctuary in secret. Now I was going to take their entire kingdom in broad daylight. I stood up slowly, adjusting the lapels of my tailored blazer. I did not yell. I did not cry for the cameras Mason was hoping to use against me. I looked at the three of them with the detached clinical observation of someone studying an infestation that needed to be eradicated. Nolan snapped his briefcase shut. The sharp clip echoed through the silent room like a gavel striking wood. He stepped close to my side, his presence a solid, immovable wall against their chaos. He leaned in slightly, his mouth hovering just inches from my ear, ensuring his words carried only to me. "Let them keep their empty house," Nolan whispered, his tone vibrating with a dark, dangerous anticipation. "The real war is no longer in this living room. It is going to be fought where they think they are the safest. We are taking this into the ledgers, and we are going to tear open the estate archives." The heavy oppressive humidity of Savannah felt different now. It no longer felt like the nostalgic blanket of my youth. It felt like a physical manifestation of the secrets my family had buried. 2 days after I walked out of that suffocating dining room, Nolan arranged a discreet meeting on the outskirts of the city. We sat in a dimly lit vinyl booth diner that smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial bleach, far away from the polished social circles my parents frequented. Sitting across from us was Tessa Boone. She was a sharp, nervously energetic woman in her late 40s who had served as the primary bookkeeper for the trust until her abrupt, unexplained resignation exactly 2 years ago. She kept glancing at the diner entrance, her hands wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug. "I knew this day was coming," Tesser said, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached into her oversized tote bag and slid a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the sticky table. "I told Grant and Caroline that the numbers were becoming impossible to hide. When they asked me to backdate a series of depreciation logs to cover a massive cash withdrawal, I packed my desk. I refused to go to federal prison for Mason's lifestyle." I opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of physical copies of old reconciliation spreadsheets, bank routing slips, and internal ledger prints. With Nolan guiding me through the accounting architecture, the mechanics of the theft became painfully clear. The riverfront warehouses held by the trust had been generating steady, substantial commercial rent for decades. But that revenue never stayed in the trust's holding accounts. Tesser pointed a shaking finger at a specific column of outgoing transfers. Every single month, 40% of the gross rental income was diverted into a shell management account. From there, it was pumped directly into Rook Bass Limited Liability Company, and from Rook Bass it went straight to Mason. The ledgers detailed a horrifying timeline of financial parasitism. The money my grandmother had intended to preserve the family legacy was instead paying for my brother's tailored suits, his first-class flights to Europe, and the staggering operational losses of his doomed boutique hotel ventures. It was a systematic, bloodless draining of my inheritance, signed and authorized by the very people who were supposed to protect it. But the financial theft was only the outer layer of the betrayal. The true psychological horror arrived later, at evening. Sitting in the sterile silence of my hotel suite, my phone chimed with a secure encrypted file sent by my cousin, Delaney Rhodes. She had managed to access an old archive family server and downloaded a cache of internal emails my parents had exchanged over the past 6 years. I scrolled through the messages, my chest tightening with every cruel, calculated sentence. They discussed me not as a daughter, but as a hostile variable that needed to be contained. The most devastating blow came from an email my mother wrote to my father 4 years ago, right when my company was securing its first major round of venture capital. Grant had expressed worry that my growing wealth might make me independent enough to hire my own financial advisors and discover the trust. Caroline's response was permanently burned into my mind. She wrote, "Do not worry about her gaining independence. She is desperate for our approval. Keep her isolated. Keep criticizing her choices, and she will always come back seeking validation. She is the easiest to control if she is hit with the fear of losing the family." I dropped the phone onto the bed. The air in the room felt impossibly thin. Every single time my mother had dismissed my achievements. Every time she made me feel like an outsider in my own home. It was not because she was a demanding parent. It was a tactical emotional starvation designed to keep me compliant. They manufactured a constant threat of abandonment so I would remain too paralyzed to ever look behind the curtain. The final shattering piece of the puzzle fell into place the following morning. Nolan walked into my suite carrying a worn leather-bound archival box he had successfully subpoenaed from the original law firm that drafted my grandmother's estate. He did not say a word. He simply extracted a fragile yellow piece of stationery and handed it to me. It was a handwritten letter from my grandmother, June, addressed to her private accountant, dated 14 years ago. I read the delicate cursive handwriting, and the solid ground beneath me entirely gave way. In the letter, my grandmother explicitly instructed her accountant to set aside a dedicated seed fund of $75,000 locked in a secure escrow account. The instructions were crystal clear. The money was to be released to me the moment I decided to launch my own independent business venture. She knew I had a mind for logistics, and she wanted to ensure I had the capital to escape Savannah. 8 years ago, when I was desperately trying to launch Northline Relay from a freezing apartment, I went to my parents and begged for a loan. They made a massive, agonizing theatrical production out of it. They claimed they had to liquidate their own personal savings. They made me sign a promissory note. They handed me a check for $75,000, telling me it was the ultimate sacrifice of their parental love. For 8 years, I carried the crushing weight of that debt. I paid them back with interest. I let them hold that loan over my head at every family gathering, silently swallowing their arrogant reminders that my entire empire was built on their generosity. It was my money. They had taken the gift my grandmother secretly left for me, laundered it through their own accounts, and handed it to me as a high-interest loan. They used my own inheritance to buy my lifelong groveling gratitude. I stood by the window of the hotel, looking out at the sprawling canopy of the Savannah oak trees. The pain of the realization was so absolute that it bypassed grief entirely and crystallized into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly calm. I began to effortlessly piece the fragmented memories of my life together into a perfect, hideous mosaic. I finally understood why my parents always waved their hands dismissively and said there was nothing to worry about whenever I asked about the estate taxes. I understood how Mason could afford to drive a $100,000 imported sports car while remaining perpetually unemployed. I understood why the hushed, urgent whispers in the living room would instantly cease the second I walked through the door. My entire life had been a meticulously curated stage play, and I was the only one who did not know I was wearing a costume. I turned away from the window and looked at Nalan. He was watching me with that same clinical assessing gaze, waiting to see if the emotional weight would crush me or forge me. "I do not just want to stop the riverfront sale anymore, Nalan," I said, my voice completely stripped of any lingering hesitation or familial warmth. "Winning a quiet legal injunction is not enough. They built this entire kingdom in the dark. I want to drag every single ledger, every email, and every lie out into the blinding light. I want their words to lose all power in this city." Nalan nodded slowly, a predatory satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. He reached for his briefcase and pulled out his phone. "Then we escalate," Nalan said smoothly. "I have already laid the groundwork. We are not going back to the farmhouse. We are taking the war to the corporate theater." He explained the next phase of the offensive. He was calling an emergency mandatory meeting with the official advisory board of the trust, the independent compliance auditors, and most importantly, the lead representatives of the private development firm purchasing the riverfront land. We were going to assemble the very people my parents desperately needed to impress. Grant and Caroline Fox had spent decades operating under the protective shield of parental authority, treating me like a naive, disobedient child. But tomorrow morning, in a glass-walled boardroom high above the city, they would no longer be allowed to speak to me as parents. They would be forced to answer as fiduciary managers publicly accused of gross misappropriation of assets, and I was going to be the one asking the questions. The conference room on the 40th floor of the downtown legal high-rise smelled of ozone and expensive roasted coffee. At precisely 10:00 in the morning, the heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing us inside a soundproof corporate battleground. Nalan had orchestrated the seating arrangement with the precision of a military general. I sat at the center of the long, polished marble table. To my right sat the independent compliance auditors and two lead acquisition directors from the private riverfront development firm, wearing tailored suits and expressions of mild irritation. To my left sat Harriet Vale, the original estate lawyer who had drafted my grandmother's will decades ago. She was a frail but incredibly sharp woman in her late 70s, her hands resting quietly over a worn leather briefcase. When my parents and my brother walked into the room, they did not look like cornered criminals. They looked like royalty who had been summoned to traffic court. Grant took the seat directly across from me, casually unbuttoning his suit jacket. He carried an air of impenetrable arrogance, operating under the delusion that this was merely a minor administrative hurdle. In his mind, all he had to do was delay the proceedings, stall the injunction, and keep the developers engaged until the riverfront money washed away his decade of financial crimes. Caroline sat beside him, refusing to make eye contact with me, her chin tilted upward in defiance. Mason took the seat nearest the door. I did not glare at them. I did not offer a greeting. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly beside a formidable stack of documentation, the reconciliation logs, the wire transfer receipts, and resting right on top, the sleek digital audio recorder. The sheer lack of emotion on my face was the first thing that cracked their armor. Mason saw the recorder. His arrogant posture instantly collapsed, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. He was the weakest link, a man who had never faced a consequence in his entire life, suddenly realizing the exits were locked. "Let us make this brief," Grant announced, leaning forward and addressing the development directors, completely ignoring Nalan and me. "My daughter has recently undergone a severe professional trauma. This meeting is the unfortunate result of a highly emotional misunderstanding regarding family assets. I assure you the trust remains fully operational and our timeline for the riverfront transfer is completely unaffected." "That is a fascinating guarantee, Gret," Nalan interrupted smoothly, rising from his chair. "Especially since you do not actually possess the legal authority to transfer a single blade of grass on that riverfront." Grant's jaw tightened. "I am the managing trustee." Nalan ignored him, turning his attention entirely to the two developers. This was the brilliant cruelty of Nolan's strategy. He was not here to argue with my father. He was here to poison the well. Nolan slid a series of stapled dossers across the marble table toward the developers. Gentlemen, before you wire a 9F figura acquisition fee to the Mercer Preservation Trust, I strongly advise your legal department to review the ownership structure of Rook Basin Limited Liability Company. The lead developer frowned, opening the dossier. What you are looking at is a systematic, unauthorized collateralization of the very land you are attempting to buy, Nolan explained, his voice echoing cleanly in the quiet room. The current trustees have secretly leveraged the riverfront property to fund private high-risk commercial debts. Furthermore, the foundational trust document strictly requires the notarized consent of the special beneficiary to execute any sale. You are currently negotiating with individuals who have no clean title, no legal clearance, and a massive undisclosed lien history. The color drained from the developer faces in the corporate world. Dirty titles and hidden liens were radioactive. The lead developer closed the folder, his expression hardening into a mask of pure professional hostility. He looked at Grant not as a respected business partner, but as a severe liability. "Is this accurate, Grant?" the developer asked, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "Are we sitting here negotiating for an encumbered asset?" "It is an internal restructuring issue," Grant barked, his calm facade shattering into defensive panic. "It will be resolved internally. We are handling the beneficiary's signature this week." Mason could not take the pressure. The room was closing in on him, and the instinct for self-preservation overrode whatever family loyalty he possessed. He pushed his chair back, holding his hands up defensively. "I have nothing to do with the management of those accounts." Mason stammered, his voice pitching high with cowardice. "I am just a passive recipient. I do not make the administrative decisions. My parents handle the transfers. I am completely separate from the sale negotiations." I finally spoke. My voice was low, steady, and utterly devoid of pity. "Are you really separate, Mason?" I asked. I reached into my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed copy of the encrypted email Delaney had recovered. I slid it across the marble surface until it stopped right in front of him. "Nolan," I said, keeping my eyes locked onto my brother's terrified face, "could you please read the highlighted text for the room?" Nolan picked up his own copy. An email sent from Mason Fox to Grant and Caroline Fox dated 3 days ago. Quote, "You have to lock down her signature before Friday. If she does not sign the relinquishment by the end of the week, the development investors will inevitably see the special inheritance clause during the final audit and the entire deal will collapse." End quote. A suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. Mason stared at the paper as if it had suddenly caught fire. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had just been publicly exposed as the primary catalyst of the extortion attempt. He had thrown his parents under the bus, and in return, Nolan had backed over him with a freight train. Caroline closed her eyes, a look of profound, nauseating defeat washing over her features. Grant was breathing heavily, his hands balled into tight fists on the table. "This is a witch hunt," Grant hissed, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. "You are twisting family correspondence out of context. I am still the trustee, and I still control the archives." Actually, a thin, growly voice interrupted. Everyone turned toward the end of the table. Harriet Vale adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses. She had been sitting so quietly that her sudden intervention felt jarring. She opened her battered leather briefcase and pulled out a heavily embossed legal ledger. "You control the active administrative archives, Grant," Harriet corrected, her tone carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of the law. "You do not control the sealed addendums." Grant froze. The anger in his eyes was instantly replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated terror. "Before June Mercer passed away," Harriet continued, addressing the room at large, "she entrusted my firm with a physical sealed codicil regarding the Mercer Preservation Trust. Her instructions were remarkably specific. The codicil was to remain locked in a private bank vault entirely inaccessible to the managing trustees." "And what are the conditions for opening it?" Nolan asked, playing his part perfectly. "The seal may only be broken," Harriet recited from memory, "upon the presentation of credible evidence that the managing trustees have engaged in self-denying or have attempted to coerce, intimidate, or disenfranchise the designated special beneficiary." She looked directly at me, then at the audio recorder resting on the table. "Given the documentation presented here today and the existence of an audio recording detailing an attempt to force a signature under false pretenses, I believe the legal threshold to break the seal has been definitively met." Grant did not just object. He panicked. He slammed both hands onto the table, half rising from his chair. "That document is invalid," Grant shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "That codicil was drafted decades ago. It was legally voided before she died. It has no standing in a modern court." The boardroom went dead silent. The two developers stared at Grant in complete disbelief. Nolan just smiled, a cold, victorious expression. Grant realized his fatal error a second too late. He had spoken too fast. If the codicil was truly a forgotten, meaningless piece of paper, he would have had no reason to react with such violent urgency by screaming that it was invalid before anyone even knew what was inside it. He had just publicly confessed that he knew exactly what the envelope contained, and that he feared it more than anything else in the world. The lead developer stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a sharp, definitive motion. "We are done here," the developer announced, his tone colder than ice. "This entire transaction is frozen. We will not be moving forward with any acquisitions, negotiations, or disbursements until this trust has undergone a full forensic federal audit and title clearance. Do not contact our offices again. Grant." The two developers walked out of the room, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind them, effectively locking away my parents' golden parachute. The millions of dollars they had schemed and stolen to secure had just vanished into thin air. Grant sank back into his chair, a hollow, defeated shell of the man who had walked in 30 minutes prior. Caroline was openly crying now, the reality of their public humiliation finally setting in. Mason sat paralyzed, staring blankly at the marble table. The public execution was over, but as I looked at my father's shaking hands, I knew the war was not entirely finished. They had lost the riverfront deal, but the true source of their power, the deepest secrets they had buried to maintain their empire, were still locked away in the dark. The meeting adjourned in a heavy, suffocating silence. I packed my documents slowly, feeling no joy, only a grim mechanical satisfaction. The final battle was not going to be fought under the fluorescent lights of a corporate high-rise. It was going to happen tomorrow morning in the underground vault, where my family still believed they could control the past. The boardroom had emptied, leaving only the stale scent of defeated ambitions and cold roasted coffee. Harriet Vale packed her leather briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. She turned to Nolan and me, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that felt louder than a shout. "The original physical cortal is locked inside a high-security archival vault at the Savannah Sovereign Depository," Harriet confirmed, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "The protocol of the institution is absolute. Breaking a sealed testament document requires the physical presence of the designated estate executive, the current trustees, and the special beneficiary. We convene tomorrow morning at exactly 9:00. I expected my parents to spend the remainder of the afternoon barricading themselves behind their Hyrek defense attorneys. I expected a vicious legal counter-maneuver. Instead, they attempted a far more insidious tactic. At precisely 4:00 in the afternoon, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Grant Fox. I answered, putting the device on speakerphone so Nolan could hear. My father's voice was completely stripped of the booming, arrogant patriarch persona he had wielded like a weapon for 3 decades. He sounded remarkably, terrifyingly gentle. It was the voice he used when trying to close a difficult business deal, wrapped in a sickening layer of manufactured paternal warmth. "We do not need to tear each other apart in public," Grant reasoned, his tone smooth and carefully modulated. "Your mother and I have discussed the situation. We are willing to step down quietly. We can arrange a private off-their-odd settlement right now. You take the reins of the trust and you drop the threat of a forensic audit. We just ask that you leave Mason his operational shares in the boutique hotel. A quiet compromise to keep the family intact." I listened to the faint static hum of the line. The sheer audacity of the request made my stomach turn. They were asking me to ignore a decade of embezzlement and fraud to save my brother's ego. But beyond the insult, my analytical mind caught the structural flaw in his negotiation. If my father genuinely believed Harriet's cortisol was an outdated, legally void piece of paper, he would have let us march into that depository and humiliate ourselves. He would never offer a preemptive surrender unless the alternative was total annihilation. He was not trying to compromise. He was terrified. He was trying to buy time to eliminate the threat. I hung up the phone without saying a single word. Nalan was already pacing the floor of my hotel suite, his eyes dark with anticipation. "They are going to make a physical move tonight," Nalan predicted, his voice tight and urgent. "People like your father do not accept defeat. They alter the battlefield." Within 2 hours, Nalan had petitioned a sympathetic state judge. He secured an emergency legal injunction, completely freezing every single asset, transfer, and deed modification attached to the Mercer Preservation Trust for the next 48 hours. But Nalan did not stop at the courthouse. He made a quiet, undocumented call to the head of security at the Savannah Sovereign Depository. He issued a strict warning that the Fox family archival box was the subject of a volatile civil dispute and was at an extremely high risk for unauthorized nocturnal tampering. The anticipation made sleep an absolute impossibility. I sat by the window of my suite, watching the street lights flicker against the thick canopy of oak trees outside. The city felt like a massive predator, holding its breath in the dark. At 2:30 in the morning, my phone vibrated violently across the nightstand. The caller identification displayed Delaney Rhodes. I answered immediately. "Eveline," my cousin whispered frantically, her voice trembling so hard I could barely understand her. "I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital. I just passed the depository district downtown. I saw your father's car. He and Mason were parked half a block from the private banking entrance. They were just sitting there in the dark with the engine off. The image of my father and brother lurking in the shadows outside a bank like desperate thieves sent a violent chill down my spine. The great untouchable foxmen, the pillars of Savannah society, reduced to prowling the streets in the dead of night to steal a dead woman's letter. They were willing to commit a felony burglary to keep me from reading my grandmother's final words." The morning air was thick, suffocating and heavy with impending rain when we arrived at the depository at a 4 to 9. The building was an imposing fortress of gray stone, polished brass, and bulletproof glass. We gathered in the hushed, cavernous lobby. Grant and Caroline arrived minutes later. Mason walked a few paces behind them. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously toward the security cameras mounted in the corners of the ceiling. A tall man in a tailored suit approached our group. He introduced himself as the senior vault manager. Before he led us toward the subterranean elevator, he stopped and looked directly at my father with a gaze of pure professional disdain. "Mr. Fox," the manager said smoothly, his voice carrying perfectly across the quiet marble lobby, "I feel legally obligated to inform you that our automated security system flagged the denied biometric access request to your family's specific vault sector at roughly 3:15 this morning. As per the emergency judicial directive filed by Mr. Pierce yesterday evening, the sector was placed on total administrative lockdown." The silence that followed was painfully dense. Grant's jaw clenched so hard I thought the bone might fracture. Mason looked physically sick, stepping backward as if hoping to blend into the marble pillars. They had actually tried to break in. They had tried to destroy the cortisol before the sun came up, and the heavy steel doors had rejected them. We descended into the basement in absolute suffocating silence. The vault hallway was a long, sterile corridor lined with heavy steel doors and illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. Caroline had maintained her facade of the pained, misunderstood mother throughout the elevator ride, constantly dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. But when we finally stopped in front of the Mercer Estate vault, the performance abruptly ended. Stamped directly across the seam of the heavy metal door was a bright, red tamper-proof legal seal applied by the state court. Caroline stared at the red tape, her breathing hitched, transforming into a rapid, shallow panic. The carefully applied makeup could not hide the sudden, absolute terror that drained the color from her face. She reached out, her fingers trembling violently, hovering just inches from the seal, but terrified to actually touch it. For the first time in 34 years, my mother was looking at a door she could not manipulate, bribe, or emotionally blackmail her way through. The realization that she had completely lost control hit her so hard her knees visibly buckled. The vault manager stepped forward, inserting a long, complex brass key into the primary lock. Harriet Vale stepped up beside him with the secondary executive key. I stood perfectly still, the cold air of the subterranean vault biting through my blazer. Behind that steel door rested the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate verdict of my grandmother's legacy. I watched the manager turn the key, hearing the heavy internal tumbler slide into place with a definitive metallic thud. I knew that in just a few minutes the heavy metal hinges would swing open. I would either reclaim the absolute truth of my past, or I would witness the final irreversible betrayal of the people who were supposed to protect me. The heavy steel hinges groaned in the sterile silence of the subterranean room. The vault manager stepped back, pulling a large, heavy metal lockbox from the designated shelf for the Fox estate. As he set it down on the stainless steel inspection table under the harsh fluorescent lights, the breath caught in my throat. The box was not pristine. Deep, jagged metallic scratches violently marred the area surrounding the primary locking mechanism. Someone had taken a desperate, aggressive tool to the metal, trying to force it open. The vault manager immediately tapped the screen of his security tablet. He pulled up the Heineken surveillance footage from exactly 3:15 in the morning. The digital video played in crystal clear resolution, showing Grant and Mason Fox standing right outside the secondary security gate. They were sweating, panicked, and aggressively trying to pry open the access panel before the biometric scanner permanently locked them out. Despite the irrefutable video evidence playing right in front of him, my father maintained a rigid, delusional posture. When Harriet Vale unlocked the scratched box and pulled out a standard, unsealed manila envelope, Grant actually let out a short, arrogant breath. He thought his late-night tampering had somehow worked. He thought he had won. Harriet pulled out a few standard tax receipts and an outdated, completely harmless copy of a preliminary will. Grant sneered, adjusting his tie, ready to declare victory and demand his reinstatement. As I stated previously, in the boardroom, Harriet said, her growly voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls, "Your mother was an incredibly thorough woman, Grant. She knew exactly what he would try to do." Harriet bypassed the metal lockbox entirely. She reached into her own personal, highly secured leather briefcase and withdrew a pristine envelope. It was heavily sealed with the thick, unbroken crimson wax insignia of her law firm. Breaking the wax seal sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside the envelope was a thick stack of parchment, a heavy iron key, a digital storage drive, and an original property deed. Nolan leaned over, examined the deed, and looked up with a predator's smile. "This is the deed to the commercial railway strip," Nolan announced, his voice vibrating with absolute triumph. "The exact, precise strip of land the riverfront developers desperately need to connect their logistics hub. Without this specific deed, their entire billion-dollar project is nothing but useless dirt. And this deed is titled exclusively under the special beneficiary." Harriet plugged the digital drive into her portable tablet. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly my grandmother was sitting in the room with us. The video quality was old, but June Mercer Fox looked directly into the camera with the sharp, unrelenting intelligence I remembered so vividly from my childhood. "Grant Caroline," June's recorded voice spoke, stripping away the heavy silence of the vault. "If you are hearing this, it means you have allowed or agreed to eclipse your duty to this family. I always knew the riverfront properties would eventually explode in value. I also knew you would view Eveline not as a daughter to share that prosperity with, but as an obstacle to eliminate." June detailed the ultimate fail-safe. The clause was ironclad. If there was ever documented proof that the managing trustees attempted to coerce, intimidate, or defraud the special beneficiary out of her rightful inheritance, their fiduciary status was immediately and permanently revoked. Total control of the Mercer Preservation Trust, including the railway deed, would instantly transfer to me. Nolan stepped forward to deliver the final lethal blow. He did not yell. He simply placed the evidence on the steel, table piece by piece. He set down the digital audio recorder containing the dining room extortion from the farmhouse. He laid out the printed copy of Mason's panicked, incriminating email. He spread out the forensic accounting trail of the Rook Bass Limited Liability Company. And finally, he pointed to the vault manager's tablet, which was still displaying my father attempting to burglarize the bank. The legal threshold is definitively met, Nolan stated with absolute crushing finality. Caroline completely shattered. The polished aristocratic matriarch dissolved in an instant. She fell to her knees on the cold concrete floor, her manicured hands grasping desperately at the hem of my skirt. Tears ruined her perfect makeup, her chest heaving with terrified sobs. "Please, Evelyn," she cried, a pathetic, agonizing sound that bounced off the steel walls. "Do not do this. Do not destroy our family. We can fix this. You need us, please." I looked down at the woman who had spent 34 years making me feel completely inadequate, unlovable, and indebted. I felt absolutely no warmth, but I also felt no rage. The emotional hold she had over me was entirely gone. "I am not destroying the family, Mom," I said, my voice completely steady and cold. "This family ended a long, long time ago. Today is simply the day the paperwork finally caught up to the reality. The execution was swift and absolute. Right there in the vault, Grant and Caroline were officially stripped of all trustee powers, pending a massive federal forensic audit. Mason's discretionary funding was instantly terminated. Without the stolen trust money to prop up his failing venture, his boutique hotel project collapsed before noon, his private investors pulling out the second the news of the frozen assets hit the wire. Every single past transaction they had authorized was locked down for severe legal review. While Harriet finalized the transfer documents, I opened the handwritten letter my grandmother had left specifically for me. Her cursive was elegant and deliberate. She wrote that she gave me the power over the estate, not just to protect the physical land, but to protect my own soul. The most valuable thing she could ever leave me was not the $20 million from my company sale or the massive riverfront deed. It was the absolute, undeniable power to never have to kneel before people who only loved me when I was useful to them. I made my decisions before we ever left the building. I would keep the June Mercer Occupational Scholarship, entirely stripping away the fraudulent shell company and turning it into a legitimate, transparent foundation for young female entrepreneurs in Savannah. I would restructure the trust, purging every single trace of my parents' influence, and I would use the railway deed to summon the developers back to the table, renegotiating the entire riverfront acquisition entirely on my own terms. For the very first time in the history of the Fox family, absolutely no one was going to speak for me. I walked out of the Savannah Sovereign Depository with Nolan by my side. The heavy oppressive storm clouds from the morning had finally broken. The bright, blinding Georgia sun poured over the white stone steps of the bank, warming my skin. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and wrapped my fingers around my grandmother's heavy iron key. Just 2 days ago, I sat in a high-rise office and made a phone call, pretending I had lost $20 million in the middle of the night. But standing in the brilliant sunlight, I realized the absolute truth. I did not lose a single thing that night. I gained my voice. I reclaimed my past. And I finally earned the right to walk completely away from the toxic ruins that other people called a family. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.